The Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by Tom Wood's Liberty Classroom. Sick of losing arguments with your statist friends? Fear no more. Now you can vanquish your intellectual foes with courses taught by top libertarian professors. Tool your intellectual arsenal and enroll today by navigating to www.libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom or by following the link in the show notes page.
Probably the single most difficult point in all of monetary analysis and monetary economics is that the banks create money supply out of thin air. Because everybody's been inured to thinking that the banks really simply borrow our money and re-lend it. It's very difficult to make the mind shift and realize that the banks are really engaging in a species of a form of legalized counterfeiting. In other words, creating new money out of thin air without having to sell goods and services. Because usually on the market, the way to acquire money is to sell goods and services in exchange for it, or else convince people into contributing money to your organization of some sort. In other words, either donation or purchasing goods and services. Also on the market, the only other way to get money is to dig it out of the ground, to dig the gold out of the ground, which is also, of course, a hassle. Another way, of course, of getting money, getting income, acquiring money, is the governmental way of stealing it, in other words, through taxation. Another way of acquiring money is to print it or create it out of thin air by some kind of prestidigitation. The major single lesson of the analysis of banking is this is what the banks do, this is what the commercial banks do. This is what so-called, it's known euphemistically as fractional reserve banking. Certain coin collectors sell coins to people and keep them for their clients as a service, and then lend the money out or don't keep them or don't have really the money there. This is a form of fractional reserve banking. Creating fictitious claims, or another way of putting it is a form of embezzlement. To use a harsher, but I still think accurate term. The bank feels, usually correctly of course, that they're able to issue uncovered banknotes or uncovered bank deposits, or, looking another way, fake warehouse receipts. To issue them because they know darn well, through experience on the market, through statistical experience or whatever, that not everybody's going to call for people who trust this bank and they think their money is there. And so they're able to get away with it for some time. My contention, however, is that it's really a form of embezzlement. Because usually if you have a warehouse receipt, there's supposed to be something behind it. If you have a certificate saying that we will redeem your 10,000 bushels of wheat at any time you ask for it, there's supposed to be 10,000 bushels of wheat there. It's not supposed to be a hot air kind of receipt. This is what the banks do. There's this division of opinion within the sound money movement, if you put it that way, about fractional reserve banking. Some of us think that fractional reserve banking should be illegal as being fraudulent, same basis as any other sort of fraud or embezzlement. Others believe that this is not fraud or embezzlement and it should not be illegal. You should be able to do this until the actual bankruptcy appears. In other words, people claim their money and don't find it. I'm in the pro-fraud camp. In other words, the camp that says that this is fraud should be outlawed. Even if we assume this is legal, which of course it has been for many years, even if we assume that fractional reserve banking is legal, even allowing this, there is in the market certain severe checks, certain severe limitations on the degree to which the banks can expand money out of thin air.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Patrick MacFarlane, appearing alone today, that is without my co-host, Jerry McCullum. I am currently in Wisconsin doing an externship. I realized that I didn't have enough hours for the summer, so I'm going to be spending a lot more time here, which makes it difficult because I'm currently without internet access. So I've been trying to put this episode together while balancing my externship, and it's just been a bit of a hassle. So if any episodes in the future are late because of that, I really hope that won't happen, but I apologize in advance for it. But recently I started reading Rothbard's America's Great Depression, which I got free, in quotes, for donating $5 to the Mises Institute. And I got this book. It's a handheld edition, or a pocket edition, rather. It's the 5th edition with the introduction by Paul Johnson. And I'm on page 30 so far, but I'm really enjoying it. Rothbard is just a joy to read. If any of you haven't read him yet, I would assume most of you have, because you're listening to this podcast. But if you haven't, you really should. You learn a whole lot by reading him, and he's actually a joy to read because his prose is very entertaining, and it's kind of in like a communicative discussion style. His books kind of read like you would imagine his lectures would go, which is very entertaining because you can just tell that he's really into it and he really enjoys what he's talking about. But in reading this book, it really made me think of the Austrian Business Cycle Theory. Because essentially in the first 30 pages, Rothbard outlines what the Austrian Business Cycle Theory is, and I think that it's such a cornerstone important part of what it means to be an Austro-libertarian, obviously, hence the name Austrian Business Cycle Theory. But I think that it's very important in light of 2008 and in light of the boom-bust cycle that we've gotten used to, that all the listeners of my podcast should have this introduction to the Austrian Business Cycle Theory and be able to understand it on a bit deeper level. With that being said, this is an episode geared towards the beginner to mid-level Austro-libertarian. I know that a lot of my listeners may already be familiar with general Austrian business cycle theory, because I have discussed it on the podcast before, which is basically when the Fed inflates asset bubbles, which cause malinvestment by proliferating cheap credit. But for your sake, for the audience's sake, I really wanted to get into the nuts and bolts of it, as I have come across already in the first 30 pages of my personal reading of America's Great Depression. Obviously, a theme going forward for the podcast has been that whatever I'm doing in my personal reading, I'm going to try and bring to the show in intermittent episodes. Because one thing that I really think is that you don't really know something until you can teach it to someone else with a degree of clarity so that they will understand. I guess this is part of my learning process as well, as I've highlighted in the show before. So without further ado, we'll dive into the subject matter here. First off, I want to jump into the question of what is the business cycle and why does it matter? And now, roughly speaking, the business cycle is the series of booms and busts that we've become accustomed to since 1913 with the founding of the Federal Reserve. And now, when I say business cycle, I'm not talking specifically about the Austrian theory of the business cycle, because the Austrians would posit that the business cycle is not something that's caused by capitalism, as our friends on the left would argue, but the business cycle comes about because of central bank policy or manipulation of monetary policy. And when we refer to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, I wanted to make it clear that we are specifically referring to the Austrian diagnoses of what the business cycle is. But so the business cycle, as I've noted, as people should know because of 2008 financial crisis and because of the general economic cycle that we've become accustomed to, is, as I've said, the way that the modern economy behaves with central banking. But essentially, the Misesian or Austrian business cycle theory is, to quote Rothbard, the economic analysis of the necessary consequences of intervention in the free market by bank credit expansion. And in America's Great Depression, first published in 1963, Rothbard explains the Austrian business cycle theory, and he's very clear to point out that there was no other theory of the business cycle that married actual economic theory with statistical analysis. I wanted to quote Rothbard from page 3 of my copy of America's Great Depression, because he's just great to read. The bulk of cycle specialists who spurn any systematic integration as impossibly deductive and overly simplified are thereby wittingly or unwittingly rejecting economics itself. For if one may forge a theory of the cycle with little or no relation to general economics, then general economics must be incorrect, failing as it does to account for such a vital economic phenomenon. For institutionalists, the pure data collectors, if not for others, this is a welcome conclusion. Even institutionalists, however, must use theory sometimes in analysis and recommendation. In fact, they end by using a concoction of ad hoc hunches, insights, etc., plucked unsystematically from various theoretical gardens. Few, if any, economists have realized that the Mises theory of the trade cycle is not just another theory, that in fact it meshes closely with the general theory of the economic system. The Mises theory is, in fact, the economic analysis of the necessary consequences of intervention in the free market by bank credit expansion. Followers of the Misesian theory have often displayed excessive modesty in pressing its claims. They have widely protested that the theory is, quote, only one of many possible explanations of business cycles, and that each theory may fit a different causal theory. In this, as in so many other realms, eclecticism is misplaced. Since the Mises theory is the only one that stems from a general economic theory, it is the only one that can provide a correct explanation. Unless we are prepared to abandon general theory, we must reject all proposed explanations that do not mesh with general economics. Basically, his critique of Keynes and his contemporaries was that they completely eschewed general economic theory when they approached the business cycle for some reason. And basically, they just used statistical analysis and threw in their own hunches with it as well. So it wasn't based in solid foundational economic theory and principles. But, not that Keynes is specifically known for doing that anyways. Of course, as we have pointed out on the podcast before, Austrian economics generally will eschew statistical analysis because, as I've said, it is unreliable. For instance, we know that the Fed lies about the consumer price index. And in another example, we know that when the GDP is calculated, they count government expenditures as being part of the GDP, which is ridiculous. Because government doesn't create anything that it didn't already take from someone else. Government doesn't produce anything. Government is basically a parasitical organization that feeds off of free individuals. So we know that the Fed lies about the consumer price index, and the government manipulates their statistics to manipulate public opinion. And since the markets in this day and age are so unhealthy and heavily reliant on what the Fed, for instance, what Janet Yellen is saying when she testifies to Congress, or what the Federal Open Market Committee will say. The markets are so unhealthy that because of whatever these Fed officials say, the market will react almost instantly. For instance, the other week, Janet Yellen was testifying in front of Congress, and there was a kid that held up a sign that said, "Buy Bitcoin," and all of a sudden Bitcoin went up. And I think personally that just shows how sick the economy is and how reactive it is and how not based in actual business principles that the economy is. But to get back to why Austrian economics eschews statistical analysis, just to briefly wrap that thought up, because it's unreliable. Like I said, we know that the Fed lies about the consumer price index. It's often the subject of manipulation, as we've said. But it's also difficult to show the cause and effect relationships between a certain action in the market. But to continue Rothbard's explanation of the Austrian business cycle, he makes the distinction between business cycles and business fluctuations. And to do so, he paints the picture of businessmen being those who attempt to forecast changes in the markets, plotting and sowing their seeds into the marketplace. Some forecasts are more successful than others, and those businessmen enjoy more profits. But we know that the market is one of constant change and flux as time preferences will fluctuate and trends of consumption and investment shift. Because of this, the market chooses winners and losers. Specifically, Rothbard makes the case that a sector of the economy can never be effectively, quote, stabilized as if these changes were not taking place. For example, he uses the parable of the locusts that come every 7 years. So in this explanation, Rothbard says that specific industries will rise and fall in certain cycles. Like if there's locusts that come every 7 years, on the 7th year, the anti-locust sector of the economy will boom. And those fluctuations are not akin to the business cycle, because the business cycle is a general cycle that encompasses the entire economy. So he wants to differentiate between the general economy and the cycles that we get in specific industries. So Rothbard explains that these natural fluctuations are benign to the business cycle, but moreover, declines in certain specific sectors of the economy, if they're natural, should be welcomed. It's just the natural effect of supply and demand. But moreover, Rothbard explains that declines in a specific industry, if natural, will not ignite a general depression, because the demand that goes out of a specific sector of the economy will shift to another industry, if healthy, that is. This is a very important point, actually, because many other schools of economic thought will attribute the bust to shortcomings within specific sectors of the economy, such as the housing bubble or the dot-com bubble. And I think it's funny to note that each bubble is named after a part of the private sector in a kind of like Orwellian newspeak effort to shift blame from government into the private sector. We've seen this happen time and time again. But ultimately, it should not be surprising to students of Mises and Rothbard to come to the conclusion that the business cycle is tied to monetary policy. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know, you're probably suspicious of central banking already. You probably are acquainted with some of the ideas of liberty, so I won't dwell on that. But Rothbard points out that if prices are fluctuating uniformly throughout the economy, the cause is not shifting demand from sector to sector, but it is, in fact, the underlying monetary policy. So a shifting in the underlying monetary policy is tied to the supply and demand for money itself. And so an increase in the supply of money will lead to falling demand for money. And we call this phenomenon inflation. However, our Keynesian friends, on the other hand, would define inflation as rising prices. And in fact, that's what you'll learn in school, is that inflation is rising prices. But we know that the rising prices are merely the effect of an increase in the money supply, and that inflation itself is just an effect of an increase in the money supply. But Rothbard further explains that the demand for money can be expressed as an eagerness for people to acquire money in exchange or to retain money in a cash balance. And all things being equal, and that phrase is very important, all things being equal, an increase in the supply of goods will increase the demand for money and will tend to lower prices. So then he points out that fluctuations in the supply and demand of money, goods, and services will not by themselves lead to the business cycle, because we know that businesses can and do make mistakes. But the main question then is what leads to such a clustering of business mistakes that powers the boom and bust cycles. And as we all know, George W. Bush famously stated that Wall Street was drunk. And well, we must ask the question of what did he mean by that and who was serving the liquor? And we would argue that Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan were the ones serving the liquor. And now it's Janet Yellen, but the one that fueled the dot-com bubble and fueled the bursting of the housing bubble in 2008. Now we're kind of getting into the specific theories of the business cycle, which is, as you all know from the fallout of 2008, with the Occupy Wall Street movement, blamed it on Wall Street specifically and blamed it on the inherent, quote, failures of capitalism, which is such an ignorant argument. But arguably an argument and movement that could be blamed on the influence of George Soros. But we won't get into that in this episode. But essentially, 2008 is just another chapter in what us as Americans, and in fact the world, as the world has transitioned to the central banking model and has become used to the idea of the U.S. hegemony with the petrodollar and with the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So as I've stated, the general question is, why does all of a sudden when business is booming and record profits are being made and investments are being made, why all of a sudden does that lead to the bust? What leads to the sudden cluster of business errors? And that's the first question that we need to ask. And paralleling the reasons why the business cycle is different from simple fluctuations in different sectors of the economy is that the bust is characterized by businesses suddenly across the board going bust. And specifically, Rothbard notes that it is the bust is experienced more heavily in the capital goods industries as opposed to the consumer goods industries, because the capital goods industries, the ones that supply raw materials, construction, and equipment to the other industries, are ones that expand much further during the boom and are therefore correspondingly hit more severely in the bust. So in a pure free market system, we know that the interest rates will be set by people's time preferences. Correspondingly, the proportion of consumption to saving or investment will be determined by these time preferences. And the reason for these boom-bust cycles essentially is the artificial expansion of credit, which isn't necessarily determined by the Federal Reserve, but moreover, it is determined by fractional reserve banking, in which case banks will loan out more money than they have in their reserves, and therefore create money artificially through the lending process. But at this point in time, Rothbard states that we need to place the blame squarely on the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve sets the reserves of the private banks and allows them to pyramid, essentially, their reserves by So right now I think the reserves are set at 10%. So essentially the Federal Reserve will set the reserves of private banks at 10% so that the private banks can multiply the amount of money that they loan out. So for every dollar that they get, they create 10 more dollars and loan them out to other customers. In the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve will they will purchase debt from the government and put it on their balance sheet, thereby increasing the supply of money in the economy. And both private banks and the Federal Reserve will do this with money that they've created essentially out of thin air or by writing numbers on a ledger. But it is done both by central banks and by private banks who practice fractional reserve banking. On the other hand, in a free market economy, one that isn't influenced by the artificial creation of credit, the interest rates are determined by lower and higher time preferences. And so lower time preferences will be reflected in greater proportions of investment to consumption, a lengthening of the structure of production, and a building up of capital. On the other hand, higher time preferences will be reflected in higher pure interest rates and a lower proportion of investment to consumption. When banks print new money in the artificial creation of credit and lend them to businesses, the new money will enter the loan market and lower the rate of interest. So it basically tricks the market into thinking that the supply of saved funds has increased. Thereby, it sends the wrong signals to businessmen and creates malinvestments in the economy. Because it looks like there's more credit than there actually is available, it shifts businessmen from investing in lower orders of production to higher orders of production, ones that are farther from the consumer. And this is something that would be totally fine if it was natural, but since it is not, it has catastrophic consequences. And this is because even though the signals in the market to businessmen have changed, the actual demand evidenced by customers and people participating in the economy actually have not changed. And because they have not changed, the businessmen acting on distorted signals, essentially the whole process will lead to the bust. Because the demand that existed before the introduction of these false signals has not changed, the businesses who have invested in these different signals will find that the demand simply is not there. And that is why Austrian economists will use the term malinvestment instead of the term overinvestment, because it's not that the markets have dumped more money into these investments. It's just that they were reading the wrong signals in terms of higher and lower orders of production, and so they placed their bets in the wrong areas. And generally, through the price discovery process and through business calculating, generally businesses are pretty good at this. But when you get the clustering of these false decisions is when you get the boom and the bust. And to do a better job of explaining this process, I'm going to quote Mises. But before I do that, let's have a word about how I'm able to designate the time financially to bring this podcast to you. Hey everyone, Pat MacFarlane here. As a listener of the Liberty Weekly podcast, you have probably heard of our feature program, Thought Crime Thursdays. If you enjoy perusing the world of dystopian fiction, you will love the course Sci-Fi, Liberty, and Dystopia. Taught by Professor Brad Berzer, a frequent guest on the Tom Woods Show, Sci-Fi, Liberty, and Dystopia is one of the most popular courses available exclusively through Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Correspondingly, it is also where I have been drawing inspiration for future installments of Thought Crime Thursdays. To gain access to this course and 18 others taught by top libertarian professors, join through our affiliate link by navigating to libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom, or follow the link in the show notes page. So this is the way that Mises describes the difference between overinvestment and malinvestment. He says, additional investment is only possible to the extent that there is an additional supply of capital goods available. The boom itself does not result in a restriction, but rather in an increase in consumption. It does not procure more capital goods for new investment. The essence of the credit expansion boom is not overinvestment, but investment in wrong lines, i.e. malinvestment, on a scale for which the capital goods available do not suffice. Their projects are unrealizable on account of the insufficient supply of capital goods. The unavoidable end of the credit expansion makes the faults committed visible. There are plants which cannot be utilized because the plants needed for the production of the complementary factors of production are lacking. Plants, the products of which cannot be sold because the consumers are more intent upon purchasing other goods which, however, are not produced in sufficient quantities. The observer notices only the malinvestments which are visible and fails to recognize that these establishments are malinvestments only because of the fact that other plants, those required for the production of the complementary factors of productions, and those required for the production of consumers' goods more urgently demanded by the public, are lacking. The whole entrepreneurial class is, as it were, in the position of a master builder who overestimates the quantity of the available supply of materials, oversizes the groundwork, and only discovers later that he lacks the material needed for the completion of the structure. It is obvious that our master builder's fault was not overinvestment, but an inappropriate investment. So to recap and sum up the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which would be the first portion of this podcast, I'm going to quote the words of Murray Rothbard. In summary, businessmen were misled by bank credit inflation to invest too much in higher-order capital goods, which could only be prosperously sustained through lower time preferences and greater savings and investment. As soon as the inflation permeates to the mass of the people, the old consumption-investment proportion is reestablished, and business investments in the higher orders are seen to have been wasteful. Businessmen were led to this error by the credit expansion and its tampering with the free market rate of interest. The boom, then, is actually a period of wasteful misinvestment. It is the time when errors are made due to bank credit's tampering with the free market. The crisis arrives when the consumers come to reestablish their desired proportions. The depression is actually the process by which the economy adjusts to the waste and error of the boom and reestablishes efficient service of consumer desires. The adjustment process consists in the rapid liquidation of the wasteful investments. Some of these will be abandoned altogether, like the western ghost towns constructed in the boom of 1816 to 1818 and deserted during the panic of 1819. Others will be shifted to other uses. Always the principle will be not to mourn past errors, but to make most efficient use of the existing stock of capital. In sum, the free market tends to satisfy voluntarily expressed consumer desires with maximum efficiency, and this includes the public's relative desires for present and future consumption. The inflationary boom hobbles this efficiency and distorts the structure of production, which no longer serves consumers properly. The crisis signals the end of this inflationary distortion, and the depression is the process by which the economy returns to the efficient service of consumers. In short, and this is a highly important point to grasp, the depression is the recovery process. The end of the depression heralds the return to normal and to optimum efficiency. The depression, then, far from being an evil scourge, is the necessary and beneficial return of the economy to normal after the distortion imposed by the boom. The boom, then, requires a bust. And the reason why in previous episodes, I think it was Getting to Ancapistan, that was the last episode, I believe, I was talking to Jerry about how I cheer on the collapse in a certain sense. And the collapse is maybe not the best term to use because it's not completely accurate. But in 2008, specifically when we answered the financial crisis with a return of the policies that caused the financial crisis in the first place, we kept interest rates close or near zero for about 7 years, from the collapse in 2008 until a few years ago when Janet Yellen and the Fed started to raise interest rates again at a quarter point at a time. And essentially, we need a depression, going off of the Austrian business cycle, we need the depression. The depression needs to come to clear out all these malinvestments that have happened since the bust happened in 2008. The reason is because we need the depression before any tangible, real growth in the economy can happen. Because before that happens, before all these malinvestments are cleared out, we are just adding to the mountain of malinvestment in the economy. And it's very frightening, that depression is, because it's unprecedented in history. The fact that interest rates have been at or near zero for 7 years has never happened before. In fact, when Alan Greenspan lowered interest rates, they stayed around 1% was the lowest that they ever stayed. And I think it was either Alan Greenspan or Ben Bernanke. But essentially, it is terrifying because this is unexplored territory. We have never before in the history of the world has this happened, where interest rates have been artificially suppressed for this long, and essentially no one knows what's going to happen. We can see that the economy is slowing down. I could cite retail sales. I could cite the auto industry and the bubble that's collapsing at this moment. You could talk about the student loan bubble, which is something that if you're a millennial, you've unfortunately had to live through, something that a lot of my friends are dealing with as they're living with their parents and they can't find work, and they're being saddled with this ridiculous student loan debt from the inflated tuition that they've had to pay, paying for overpriced degrees that are not worth the time or money that you spend on them. Part of that has to do as well with investing in degrees that don't make any sense. I mean, I know personally because I was an English major, but also because and this is an aside that I won't dwell on, but this is pertinent because because of the distortions in the market, malinvestments do take place. But another thing that happens is that the quality of the product also deteriorates. And so specifically when I'm talking about the boom that the federal government has created by guaranteeing student loans, you see in prices skyrocketing, and you also see the value of the education going down. I can speak personally, I went to the University of Minnesota and I got an English degree. I told myself that if I got an English degree, I focused in creative writing, which is kind of a laugh, but I only allowed myself to do that if I also correspondingly promised myself that I would go to law school afterwards. And so that was my plan. And I guess it seems to be working out right now, but I'd rather do the podcast, to be honest. But I wanted to say that I didn't really learn all that much when I was in school through my English degree. Normally when students way back in the day, when they would get an undergraduate degree, they actually learned the classics, and they learned it without being propagandized with the SJW framework, which is what I had to sit through and endure when I was at the University of Minnesota. But moreover, everyone knew that you could BS your way through class by not actually reading anything and just going on SparkNotes or something like that, which is what I would say a good 80 to 90% of my classmates did. But yeah, we are in unprecedented territory at the moment, and it's kind of scary. The way that I see it, heavily influenced by Peter Schiff and others, as listeners of the podcast will recall, is that the Fed is backed into a corner. They've run out of ammunition because interest rates have been at or near zero for such a long period of time, and there hasn't been any real sustainable growth in the economy. And so that if we start to go south again, despite the unprecedented lowering of and sustained suppression of interest rates, the Fed has no more ammunition with which to try and jumpstart the economy in their Keynesian fantasies that they can control the economy like they're pressing the brake or the accelerator on a car. And the car's about to run out of road, I would believe. And when that does happen, when the economy starts to go bust again, the Fed does not have any ammunition, quote unquote, with which to lower interest rates and flood the economy again with this cheap credit. And the quandary that they're stuck in is that I feel like they're trying to raise interest rates so that they can cut them again when things start to go south. As we know, the rising of interest rates and the associated deflation bring about the uncovering of some of these malinvestments. So when you blow up the balloon, so to speak, the balloon starts to let out air, and essentially the Fed is trying to blow air back into the balloon at the same time that the air is also leaking out of the balloon. But at one point you reach a critical mass when you can't possibly fit enough air into your lungs to blow the balloon back up again. And at that point, the Fed is going to have, or the country, moreover, is going to have two options. Either you default on the national debt and essentially junk the nation's credit rating, and you raise interest rates, which will lead to a very uncomfortable time for a lot of Americans. If it's done right, I believe, and we switch to the gold standard as well. And if it's done right, I believe that the the period of crash, so to speak, as everything resets, the necessary recession to clear out these malinvestments, if it's done right, it could be rather swift. We see in the small crash that preceded the Great Depression, this happened, and the Depression only, from that small crash, it only lasted a year or so as things kind of reset. The Fed didn't try and help, quote unquote, the economy. And so if we default on the national debt and we switch back to the gold standard, if we end the Fed and do everything basically that Ron Paul wants to do if he was elected president, then this uncomfortable period could be over rather quickly. It would also involve bringing the troops home and ending the war on drugs, restoring America as Ron Paul's campaign was in 2012. But the other more likely route that the Fed will bring us down is that when the economy starts to go south, they will cut rates again. They might try and go to negative rates. They will try more quantitative easing, which is basically when they flood the economy with money. And this runs the danger of hyperinflation like Weimar Republic Germany. And I think that's more likely. The demise of the dollar is what more likely we're facing. So I really wanted to tackle this concept because I throw around the term the collapse a lot. I think the collapse is just an easy word to use. And like I said, maybe it's not as accurate or appropriate, but I still like it because, I don't know, it has shock value. But I think that's the most likely path, is that we'd be headed down hyperinflation. And from that point, you get into the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the establishment of a world currency. If the dollar collapses and the U.S. hegemony ends, then we would have to switch to what's called the SDR, which stands for Special Drawing Rights. And that would be the currency with which, and this is how I've heard it described, is that the SDR is the currency with which nations and corporations will use to trade with each other. But we would have local currencies, which the plebs, us in the country would use. And I've heard that described as being a cashless currency. Is that the direction that things are trending in, where they can inflate it, they could manipulate it, whatever they want. They wouldn't even have to print the money, but they would find ways to manipulate it like that. Also, it would allow for complete surveillance of every transaction that took place. And so that's the future. If you're an Austrian economist and you believe in these fundamental principles, like I said to Jerry in the last episode, you believe in an eventual collapse. And I would posit, maybe this is my response episode to Jerry, so since I'm alone in this one, so he can hear my reasoning here, that this cycle is the cycle that it will end. This is the fundamental paradigm shift where we can go no further because the Fed is backed into a corner. They don't have any ammunition left. Interest rates have been at or near zero for 7 years. And even holding them down at 1% in the Alan Greenspan era was unprecedented at the time. It was extreme measures. And so, yeah, in short, we're in uncharted territory. And if you're a prepper, if you're someone that, believes, if you're a follower of Mises and Rothbard, this is it. This is the situation. And so I'd love to be proven wrong, but it might be a few years. I think another tenet of Austrian economics is that we can't say when it will happen, but we know that based on our solid foundational, rules of economics and the Austrian theory of the business cycle, we know that the bust is coming. And the next bust has to be the last one. It just has to be, based on everything that I've hashed over in the last 5 minutes. But I think it's funny, when I was at Freedom Fest, which was almost exactly a year ago, I had some friends who were left libertarians, I guess you would say, and I think they were monetarists like Friedmanites, but they would say, well, hey, the problem with Austrian economics is that they've predicted 8 out of the last 3 crashes. So like I said, it's hard to predict Austrian economists have been predicting the fall and demise of the American empire for decades, but I think the shocking thing is that we've made it to this point without the collapse happening and without the decline of American hegemony across the world. But I would say that has to do a lot with the petrodollar and our military, to this point, military supremacy across the world. I hope that you enjoyed my presentation on the Austrian theory of the business cycle. There's a lot more there, and I would direct you towards Mises' YouTube account, which I'll link in the show notes page. But I would also direct you to reading a copy of America's Great Depression, or picking up Mises' Human Action, in which he goes into detail about the Austrian theory of the business cycle and pretty much everything else. I mean, it's the foundational treatise, or one of them, that along with Man, Economy, and State, which is Rothbard's work, his magnum opus, that is necessary reading. But as we're closing up here, a few housekeeping measures. As always, subscribe to our email list, where you will get personalized content updates from me. I've been quite busy actually in the last couple weeks, so I haven't been sending out more emails than just the content updates, but I have bigger plans for that email list, things that I've done in the past, but I'm pretty excited to implement that when I get enough time. Like I said, I'm on my externship right now, and I don't have internet access at my parents' cabin, which is where I'm staying while I'm doing it, and so it makes things a little more difficult. On the other hand, it would really help us out to subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever platform that you're listening to. Specifically, I've been calling for listeners to give us ratings on iTunes. The best rating would be a written rating, because if we get written ratings or any kind of ratings, it affects which tier we are featured at in the iTunes store. And so that would help us get more exposure and expand the podcast. As always, the way that we bring the podcast to you is through the Liberty Weekly affiliate resources page, which you can find at libertyweekly.net/resources. And in there, as I've mentioned before, we have selected some products and services that we really do, that I've used personally in the past, and that we really would recommend and do think that would make your life better. And it would help support the podcast at the same time. So we would really appreciate if you would check that out as well. As a part of that resources page, you can find and follow our affiliate links to those products and services that we recommend. And you can also find, for some of the products and services, you can find coupon codes. Specifically, right now, there are coupon codes up for, I believe, Udemy and for Liberty Classroom. So if you're going to get a subscription to Liberty Classroom, which I would definitely suggest, you can get coupon codes through our affiliate pages. And just an update on Liberty Classroom is that Tom Woods has been doing Q&As, live Q&As for special members, where you can ask questions of specific professors as they appear. So in no other place can you get that one-on-one direct connection with top libertarian professors of this day and age. It really is quite the opportunity to interact with some of the top minds from our movement. But I think that's it for me. I really appreciate you tuning in for this latest episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I hope that I could hold a candle up to the bright burning star that is Murray Rothbard and help the audience understand why the economy acts the way it does and the mischief that is behind A, fractional reserve banking, and B, the Federal Reserve. Thank you.